Welcome to part 2 of the walkthrough for Zenith for Unreal tournament. And by the way, this mission is super long, so I'll try to cut it where I can. But I'm not going to be able to do too much because I still have to show, where to go and everything. But I did have to compress it, so I have a picture-in-picture of basically these bonus areas or extra areas that you can go to, since I want to get it below 30 minutes. In fact, I'm also speeding up the beginning. But what you do in the beginning is pretty simple. You just go up the rig and activate the button, and then the doors open, and then that's it. So now we're on mission 2, the Usurper. And the first map, I believe, is Dread Alps. And in this, there were a few different experimentations with visuals that sort of made, for example, like a high mountain blizzard to have an enclosure of fog and constant snow was different than maybe just having textures there of snow, to be facetious. And I get that, because the way volumetric fog is rendered in Unreal, it can drop FPS more so if you have a less hardy CPU. But aside from that, the whole snowy environment, while it wasn't necessarily something new, was something that tried to distinguish the mission set from maybe other maps. Plus, it's one thing to have a few white textures, like I said, to be facetious, but it's a lot more to have a more involved environment if there's some ambience to it. So the snow, the fog, the trees, and so forth sort of provided that. And for an experiment, the outcome wasn't too troubling. But I'd say that Project Xeraphimy, for example, implemented this sort of environment in a better way, although they did have also more opportunities to do so. And by the way, you might notice that some of the music is from Alexander Brandon's Violet Eclectic, which you can download at alexanderbrandon.net if you purchase it for yourself. But anyway, the crown jewel, I think, is of these, or this first map at least, is the exit after the capture of the player, because it sort of gives a greater sense of location and grounds to the level. And I think the skybox here was something that sort of enveloped the map to let the player feel a sort of conceptual groundness. But that's just with regards to the first map, like I said. The other part of the experiment, I think, was the newer approach to terrain. And if you notice, if you go through that, it sort of is distinct from typical terrain in Unreal, which certainly worked in comparison to the beta level Japa Mountains, I think. Or at least in contrast, it was a lot more efficient and a lot more visually pleasing. The map also acted as a sort of inadvertent introduction to the sequencing system in Zenith, which allowed pawns to do things that normally they wouldn't do. I think, for example, if, say, a veteran Unreal player, someone who's played a lot of campaigns in Unreal 1, Return to Napoli, ONP, things like that, or maybe just standard old school amped campaigns, they would be probably surprised to see a crawl not only talking and acting like it has a personality, but also interacting with other things, or that you have allies at all might be one thing. But of course, ONP's ally pawn system was there before this, and ONP's ally pawn system was an extension of a set of basic scripts that had seldom been used in Unreal but were present, and they were floating around. Zenith's ally system is derived from that and uses some of the features of ONP, but combined more features from UT's bot system and added things like alarm points and alarm point sequencing that scripted pawns had also, but also added sequencing that was controlled by a few distinct actors. And the great distinction and one of the unique features of Zenith's ally system was just that. Pretty much players could interact with pawns that the level designer specified. And they could do something like begin dialogue or interact in unconventional ways, and that sort of set apart these kinds of pawns from the typical pawn in Unreal. I mean, if you think about it, if you go through most campaigns, 90% of the campaigns were either for a pawn, they were either there to kill or be killed, pretty much. And sure, you'd get maybe like an alarm point event here and there through Unreal and some of these, even the large-scale campaigns, but nothing more extensive than that usually. In the last level of ONP, there's the case where you basically meet another human, and that's sort of more of a scene, and then the rest of it is just you along with an ally pawn, finishing off the rest of the enemies. That actually brings to mind the quest system, because two pawns do offer quests in Mission 2.2, which will also be shown in the walkthrough in picture-in-picture, like I said, where you basically you do something within the map and you're rewarded for it. And this wasn't really used in this context, in the context of this mission, throughout the campaign. So Mission 2 was a sort of distinction from convention as much as Mission 1 was, but in a different way. In Mission 2.2, you could pretty much complete all of the objectives in whatever order you wanted, including some of the side quests. Obviously that was a lot different from traditional levels. And I don't really think that there was anything, nothing comes to mind that is anything like it, except something like Legacy, where you could go to certain places where you had to retrieve certain items, except that was done in order. In Mission 2.2 you could pretty much roam around the entire map, and it was sort of like a region instead of going through a pipeline. For example, say Radjigar Mines in Unreal 1 is basically a pipeline map where basically you physically go from A to B to C. But you have to go to B to get to C. There's no other way around. There's no different way to complete the map. In Mission 2.2, there's pretty much multiple ways of going about the same thing. And in subsequent maps, there are multiple ways of finishing the level that also change the course of the level and, in some extension, the storyline. The other distinction, I think, was that instead of just going from A to B physically and taking out a few enemies in the process, there was a twist to it. You had to basically do more specific things. And of course it doesn't stray from the entertainment of killing things, but instead of, for example, maybe going to one of the estates like a pipeline map, like something like going through the Nally Castle in Unreal 1, it was pretty easy to enter it and get to where you needed to be, but after that you had a challenge, which was the mortar challenge. And obviously that wasn't a pristine presentation in comparison to others, but it was still unorthodox. In maybe an aesthetic contrast, the mini-tourney challenge that you also have to do was different and very well executed in comparison. Even the simplest one where you recruit Locke, in another case, in this case you had to fight him, in other words, doing something unorthodox, or something maybe that the player did not expect. No other campaign, I think, had the sort of interaction where you had to do something like that. So in retrospect, Mission 2.2 may not have had like a colossal impact in terms of visuals, but its technical implementation and the unorthodox approach to gameplay within the level, I think, gives it a few marks that other maps in both Zenith and other campaigns do not have. That sort of seems to be a pattern in Zenith, where it's typical that there is a sort of unconventional aspect of gameplay throughout the game, the campaign, but also some distinction that separates each map from each other map. Some cases are exceptions, like in between Mission 3 and 4, I believe, or somewhere around there. They're pretty conventional, basically pretty much pipeline maps like I described. But for the most part, it does attempt to clearly be different. But when I say that a map wasn't visually grand, well, in this case, I don't mean it wasn't visually aesthetic. I don't think it was conceptually grand. I don't think that the player's really awed by that map. But the experimentation with different approaches to lighting and the use of a distinct color palette and maybe differences in architecture of this map in comparison to other maps that use the Skytown texture pack make for a pretty different environmental experience. I think the biggest issue though with this map is that in some cases it was somewhat difficult to figure out where to go or what exactly you were supposed to do. It wasn't obvious, for example, that you had to fill the well with water and jump down it, and then, of course, even before you know to fill the well, you have to figure out where you know, control the well, or what button you press at what location. So the other three main objectives, I think, were pretty easy, but then there was that one where you had to go into the building and find the control panel to fill the well. Now the side quests, in comparison, were even more difficult, and overall were incredibly difficult to discern, in the sense that the hints as to where to go were difficult to interpret, or just not there. And I think there needed to be some greater indication of what to do, or basically maybe a way to physically point out the starting point of where to go. Even though the side quests were basically a tantamount to like treasure hunts, I thought it was excessive to simply let the player figure out almost everything on their own with regards to those side quests. And that becomes especially problematic though when there's something that you need to do in order to move on. One thing I didn't mention was that the use of staves as your only combat weapon was an interesting take on, well, on real combat. And this was another way to submerge the player into doing something in maybe a different way, and partially seemed to serve as an experiment in terms of the technical workings of it, in terms of changing the properties of the player across maps. And that's more with regard to, again, the technical workings of it. I don't think that really affects the gameplay. I think the downside to the staffs was that it might have been troubling for some players to get used to timed attacks, because each of the staffs provides a certain type of attack and a certain delay, but each one is also delayed depending on the damage, which is really unheard of in Unreal Weapons' arsenal. And it sort of accidentally led to sort of a challenge of calculating the strike with aim and timing, and in terms of damage proportions, I think it's not too much to complain about. So I'd like to comment also, though, on what you're supposed to do in the side quests, in case the video is not as telling as I think it is. Well, basically, where you start off, where you spawn, you know, there's a church next to where the guy is dead, next to those two guards. In other words, if you just go down or go forward, starting out where you spawn without, you know, moving anywhere, turning anywhere, then eventually to your right will be a church. You go in that church and you talk to that guy, the crawl. Then he gives you a quest, and basically there's 3 things you have to find. One of them is buried next to the tree, in the structure nearby the church, and all you have to do is shoot the ground next to the tree, and you can dig it out. Then there's also the one in the canal. Basically, on the left, if you face away from the church, on the left side there's going to be an X-marked area where it's basically a door, and you open that door, then swim up and grab that gem. And the third one is basically a torch behind the estate if you go down, keep going down the canal. And basically all you have to do is shoot it, shoot the top so the fire lights up, and then it opens, and then you get the crystal. Then with those 3 things, you go back to the church and you talk to the Nally. Then he'll lead you to the staff. You take that staff, and then you go back to the estate where you found the crystal. And then at that place, it's pretty easy to find basically the blacksmith, and then you give it to him, and he gives you the staff. But the other one is a little, maybe not so much involved, but you have to do things that you would already have to do in the main objective. So basically you talk to those guards, and they give you a quest to find some guy. And then you go, basically there's that building that when you start off, the building is to your right. You go behind that building, and then there's another little hut that leads underground, and then that's where you find him. Then you talk to him, and he tells you to go find and kill some people. What you have to do is first fill the well. And you have 2 choices. You can either go down the well after that, you know, once you've filled it with water. And then there's a key on the bench. And then with that key, you can open the door that leads to the control panel where the Scar officer is. And you kill him and you know, activate the control panel, and it opens the door that is otherwise closed. And then you can, you know, just kill the rest of those guys, and then you get your gold. But there's also the way to do it where, if I recall correctly, there's basically to the left where you first spawn, to the left, that bigger building. If you go in there and you go to the second elevator that is less noticeable, you go up it, and then you go up the next elevator, you go all the way around into that curved bridge, and then activate that control panel on the other side, and that will basically open the hatch that's in the underwater well. And I hope I didn't sound too confusing there, but like I said, there's video for it as well.